Hi. I know I'm gonna get mean comments on here. I know I'm gonna get thrashed on by a lot of people. Um, I don't appreciate it, but oh well. Um, I'm reading The Man with the Angel's Face, Stephen is Sown. It's a Bible story from Acts 6, verse 8 to chapter 8, verse 2. The 7 men in charge of problems were all unusual men. They were men who loved to pray and work for God. All were filled with God's Spirit, and one of the 7 stood out above the others. He was such an outstanding man of God that everyone looked up to him as a leader. His name was Stephen. Stephen seemed to have a special power from God. Often when he was working for God, Stephen would do some great miracle. Of course he did such things, and more people began to talk about Stephen and his power. This made his enemies hate him very much. The religious leaders hated Stephen even more than when they saw how many people he was winning to Jesus. Even their own priests were becoming believers. Stephen had to be stopped. I have a plan, one of the religious leaders said. Let's argue with Stephen with all of our wisdom. We'll make him look foolish before others. The others thought it was a good idea, and when the right time came, began to argue with Stephen. But things did not go the way they had planned. Instead of making Stephen look foolish, the religious leaders looked foolish. Stephen was so wise and so full of the Spirit of God that he could not do as well as he could. They could not do as well as he could. This made the religious leaders very, very angry. There was only one thing left to do. If they could not get the best of Stephen, they would stir up people against him. So the leaders hired some men to lie about Stephen. We heard him curse Moses, said some. Yes, said others, we heard him curse God. When the crowds of people heard that, they became very angry. Kill him, they shouted. This was exactly what religious leaders wanted. Now they could take Stephen before the council for the trial, so they arrested him and took him before the council. The larger group of the religious leaders. The men who had paid a lie came along. They must lie again to the council. So he's always saying things against the temple, the lying men shouted, pointing their fingers at Stephen. We heard him say that Jesus would tear down the temple and throw Moses' laws out, said some others. The men on the council all looked up at Stephen to see what he would say, but when they did, they were shocked by what they had saw. Stephen didn't look like an ordinary man now. His face was shining, and it looked like an angel's face. But the leaders did not care how Stephen looked. They still hated him and wanted to kill him. Are these things true? The high priest asked Stephen. Stephen began to tell how God had worked among his people through the years. He told how he had worked with Abraham and Joseph and Moses. He had told how God had worked in his son Jesus. But you murdered him, Stephen said, pointing at the leader. But you murdered him, Stephen said, pointing at the leaders, just as your fathers and grandfathers murdered the prophets. When the leaders heard that, they got so angry that they began to grind their teeth together. How dare you say such things in the most important people in the country? But Stephen wasn't through talking yet. He was filled with God's Spirit. Looking up into heaven, Stephen saw Jesus standing on God's right hand. Look, Stephen said, I see the heavens opened. Jesus is standing there right beside God at his right hand. It was too much for the leaders. They didn't even wait to judge Stephen. Rushing upon them, they dragged him outside the city to stone him. Some even held their hands over their ears so they couldn't hear what Stephen was saying. The men who had paid to lie had to throw stones that would kill Stephen. They didn't seem to mind that. If they would take the money to have a man killed, they did it. What did it matter to them if they had to do the killing? They took off their coats and laid them near a young man named Saul. Stephen knew that he only had a few minutes to live, so he knelt down and began to pray. Lord Jesus, he prayed, I'm going to die now, so let me be with you. When the murderers began to throw big stones at Stephen, one of them hit him until he fell onto the ground. With one last breath, Stephen prayed again. Lord, don't punish them for this sin, he said, as he had stopped breathing and lay very still. Stephen, the man with the angel's face, was dead, and he had gone to be with Jesus. Some things to think about. What kind of person was Stephen? Do you think Stephen deserved to die because of the things he believed? Do you think Stephen would have made a good member of your church? Would he have made a good deacon of your church? Why did the religious leaders have Stephen stoned? Why did they hate him so much? Do you think that these religious leaders really loved God? If Stephen preached at your church next Sunday morning, what are some things that he might say in his ceremony? Would his ceremony speak for God or against God? If Stephen was for God, do you think the religious leaders who had killed him were for God? The religious leaders, such as the Pharisees, hated Jesus because he had said he was God's son, and because they did not obey the rules, Jesus taught people to obey God's rules instead. So they had also hated everyone who followed Jesus. That's why Stephen was hated so much. This is a family Bible. It's really old. My mom had it since she was a kid too. So I hope you enjoy it. Like I said, I really don't appreciate the snide comments that I know I'm gonna get, but I was put on this earth for a reason.